Big applause going around. Next speaker on the right, we have Jason Gherkin making his way to the stage. Alright, hello everyone. Thank you. My name is Jason, and I've been compared extensively to Sheldon Cooper. Personally, I don't see it. For a start, I work at the Hunter Medical Research Institute behind the John Hunter Hospital, and I work in immunology labs with respiratory viruses, and I test novel therapeutics. So that means I do real science. So I personally think that I've actually got something more in common with Anthony Kiedis, the front man of the Red Hot Chili Peppers. You see, in my research, I get to also experiment extensively with drugs. Even though I'm an immunologist though, I'm less interested in what goes in your arm. I'm more interested in what I can get up my nose. Yep, I work with nasal sprays. So for a few years I've been working with this Melbourne-based company, Ena Respiratory. The concept is, you squirt this on your face, suck it up your nose, a couple times a week, a few days apart, and you're protected from a broad range of respiratory viruses. In fact, after some phase 2 clinical trials started that were very successful, this received a big cash injection from the US to move on developing this as a dry powder formulation so it can be stockpiled. So that means the US is now spending large sums of money on stockpiles of white powder drugs that go up your nose. Me gusta. Obviously, that's not what I'm talking about. This drug actually works by stimulating your innate immune system to make you naturally more resistant to infection. I know how to do it. The innate immune system is obviously very difficult to understand, right? To convey to a large, broad audience. So, we need an analogy. No, I'm not going to do this song. Right, but in this analogy, your innate immune system is analogous to the Night's Watch, right? It's your second line of defense. Your first line of defense against infection are those physical barriers between you and the outside world. So it's like the ice wall from Game of Thrones, protects the good folk of the Seven Kingdoms from all those wildlings, mammoths, giants, all the rest of it, right? It's everything that operates in, on, and around that wall to protect you. So, yeah, it's the Night's Watch. You're born with your innate immune system functioning as is today, and it responds rapidly to a broad range of infections. It's a separate arm of your immune system to the adaptive immune system or memory immune system that's exploited by things like vaccines. That arm of your immune system takes days to kick in, right? And it's more analogous to Stannis Baratheon swooping in at the end of the battle to claim a strategic win. But how do I put this in the context of your respiratory tracts, right? Up your nose. Well, right there is your epithelium, right? That's your ice wall. That's what separates your body from the outside world and the air that you breathe. And if you zoom right in on those epithelial cells that line your respiratory tract, you'd see there's a number of sentinels that line those cells. Here I've just used this some generic Night's Watch cosplayer to depict our toll-like receptors. So these are little molecules that detect infectious pathogens and mount your immune response. The human genome encodes for about 10 of these. But the star of tonight's show is this dynamic duo, the Sam and John, the ones we care about, the toll-like receptor 2,6 dimer. So what our nasal spray does is it brings down these little activators of this dimer so that they're armed essentially with dragon glass or Valerian steel, so that they're primed and ready to respond efficiently to infection when it does occur. I should also state that there are some receptors hidden away inside the cells on these things called endosomes, but we don't want to harm those because they're somewhat inflammatory. So what actually happens when this drug activates this receptor? Well, this is the response after just 6 hours. This is some hardcore data, alright? This is quite complicated. But every one of those little red dots, it's analogous to a Night's Watchman grabbing his sword and his shield and manning the wall, right? So the further to the right it is on the graph, the more activated it is. And the higher it is, the less chance it's due to just random probability, right? So everything in this little red box is an activated immune response marker. After just 24 hours, in the absence of infection, most of this subsides. So the Night's Watch, they get bored, there's nothing happening, so they pack up their gear and they go back to their frozen beds. That's without infection. If you do encounter an infection within a week of this dose, of your last dose, the response is awesome. It's organized, it's enhanced. Basically, this is what happens. Everything that's in blue, there we go, that's an antiviral immune response marker that's enhanced over and above what you would normally produce in response to the virus infection alone without the drug. So what we have is a well-tolerated nasal spray that activates your innate immune system to make you resistant to infection. But I haven't shown that yet. What actually happens to viral load in your respiratory tract? So we've tested this in our labs at HMRI in the context of coronavirus infection. And what we see is reduced viral load in the respiratory epithelium. Our collaborators down in Melbourne at the Peter Doherty Institute, they tested this in the context of influenza infection, and again, reduced viral load in the respiratory tract. In our labs, I've shown in the context of coronavirus infection, again, same deal. This elevated immune profile makes you more resistant to virus infections across a broad range of respiratory viruses. But how does this compare to what's already on the market? We've got pretty good antivirals, vaccines against a number of respiratory viruses, including COVID-19, right? But something like this addresses two main issues in the market. The first is that viruses are mutational masters. They can quickly adapt resistance to things like antivirals, so we have to use them very sparingly. The second, it takes a really long time to develop stuff like this in the event of a new outbreak. So with things like antivirals and vaccines, you've got to get them through research and development, clinical trials, manufacture, scale-up hurdles. It takes a really long time. And with vaccines, you've got to contend with the conspiracy nuts and anti-vaxxers. And who knows in the event of a new outbreak whether we'll have Kevin Rudd on hand to call up the Pfizer CEO and get our hands on some vaccines like ScoMo's older, better brother. On vaccines, we've got some pretty good vaccines against COVID-19, against seasonal influenza and RSV, respiratory syncytial virus. The issue is that still leaves about 200 other respiratory viruses that we know already infect the human respiratory tract and cause disease. And it also doesn't take into consideration this guy, the pangolin. He's pretty cute, right? Gives me Pokemon vibes. I look at this and I see Sandshrew or Sandslash. Here's some of his endearing features. Unfortunately, he's also heavily implicated in the emergence of the novel coronavirus strain, SARS-CoV-2, that plunged us into this half-decade pandemic. It's thought that he cooked up some of those necessary mutations to jump that species gap in that big schnoz of his that comprises 90% of his face. Given that sizable nose, though, it also means that during a novel outbreak, he also probably suffers greatly. Don't worry, he's not dead. He's just a soot. But thanks to the pangolin and other weirdos like him, we've already experienced 3 novel coronavirus outbreaks in a little over 2 decades, right? So unfortunately, COVID-19 is likely not going to be the last pandemic that we'll witness in our lifetime. And the PhD student that I stole this off hasn't included influenza on this. There's even more going on than what's displayed, right? Now there's this pool of viruses that exist in the animal kingdom just waiting for their pangolin prince to carry them forth into the realms of human infection. But when that happens, who's going to be the spreader? Not the pangolin. Here is our new viral-infested bacterial respiratory disease. This little guy's the future nemesis of disease control. Probably the reason Dan Andrews failed in Victoria. And speaking of lockdowns, it does make sense to limit our movement and contact as much as possible if we're the spreaders, right? But let me tell you about my lockdown. I was lucky enough to secure a mortgage for a house. Awesome, right? Only issue was, this was my house. So I got to experience lockdown living with my in-laws. With no escape. They're good people, but there's only so much Big Bang Theory that a scientist can sit through. Anyway, coming soon, hopefully, lockdowns will be a thing of the past, because in Australia, we'll have things like this nasal spray to protect us. Or if you're in the US. I don't know if that ball reconstituting it. If it doesn't happen, we can always resort to conventional disease control mechanisms like keeping our hands and surfaces clean. But the virus is in the air, right? So we'll need to mask up again. We were very good at that, weren't we? Speaking of missing the whole fucking point. Maybe we could go back to stockpiling toilet paper again. Or we could do what they've done with other respiratory pathogens and just remove the disease vector from the equation. Anyway, my house is built now, so bring it on. Thank you for listening to my talk about our nasal spray, and thank you to everyone that I work with, some of which are here tonight. Jason David!